everyone, it's Sevi. After a lot of discussion and controversy about her, Dehya's finally arrived in her limited banner, and afterwards she'll remain as a permanent standard character. You're likely aware of how she's been under a lot of scrutiny leading up to her release, and there's already a general consensus on how bad she's going to be. But to be clear, the goal of this guide is to help you understand what she's capable of, what her shortcomings are, and just overall how to make her work as best as possible in the current state of things. And so we're going to take a look at her kit, builds, teams, and my overall evaluation and considerations for her. Let's get into it.
My name's Dehya. I'm the merc you hired. So, what you got for me?
Dehya's role is a mixed bag of defensive support utilities plus pyro damage dealing and application. Let's go through her talents to understand what she offers and her potential roles. Dehya's normal attacks consist of a 4-hit combo of physical damage. The 3rd and 4th hit particularly can stagger light enemies. Her charge attack also makes her continuously swing her sword forward. Generally speaking, Dehya's damage won't come mainly from her auto attacks since she can't infuse them with pyro unless you have a C6 Bennett. Rather, her primary sources of pyro damage are her skill and burst. Dehya's skill, Molten Inferno, can be cast twice. Casting it the first time deals AoE pyro damage and places down the Fiery Sanctum field. Then you can cast it a second time, which deals another stronger instance of AoE pyro damage and repositions the field to her current position. The entire field lasts for 12 seconds and has a 20-second cooldown. Note that your second cast will not refresh the duration, but simply reposition it. This field then provides effects for characters or enemies inside it. If an enemy takes damage, Dehya deals a coordinated attack of AoE pyro damage, which scales on her attack and HP stats. This can affect multiple enemies clumped together or even trigger Burgeon on nearby dendro cores. However, this coordinated attack can only be triggered every 2.5 seconds, which is relatively long compared to other examples of coordinated attack abilities like Raiden and Thoma. As a result, Dehya's field won't be able to trigger as many reactions, and its damage over time is quite poor. On the other hand, its slower frequency at least lets you have more predictable control over the elemental reactions taking place. Proccing the coordinated attack damage will also create one pyro particle. If you use Dehya more off-field, she will naturally get less energy from her particles compared to her being on-field, which can lead to some energy issues. Moving on, another important effect is that party members within the field gain a level 1 interruption resistance buff. When you unlock her first Ascension passive, she further stacks another interruption resistance buff called the Golden Forged Form that lasts 9 seconds upon her initial skill cast, which we can call the level 2 version. From experience, the level 2 interruption resistance buff is very reliable to let you stop worrying about getting staggered even from the hardest hitting attacks. But note that when her A1 passive expires, she'll only give the level 1 buff for 3 seconds, which is more likely to get you staggered. And finally, the most unique aspect about Dehya's field is the damage redirection effect. There's something I want to clarify though. Although the talent descriptions refer to it as damage mitigation, which should mean the damage gets reduced, that isn't exactly the case. Rather, it's redirected towards Dehya. So for accuracy, I'd rather call it damage redirection. Anyway, if a character in the field gets damaged, a portion of that will instead be redirected to Dehya's red main blood so that she receives it over a period of time. For example, at talent level 9, she'll redirect 48% of the damage received by the active character to herself, though there is a limit as to how much she can receive this way, which is double her max HP. With her first Ascension passive, her red main blood effect takes 60% less damage for 6 seconds when you use her second skill cast or burst. And when her 4th Ascension passive is unlocked, she gains a self-healing mechanic that kicks in when she's at less than 40% HP, whether she's on-field or off-field, though this has a cooldown of 20 seconds. This is her built-in survival mechanism from the redirected damage. It's important to understand the limitations of her skill's defensive effects. While they do help your team's survival, this is not a 1:1 replacement for shielding, healing, or damage reduction effects. Shielding completely prevents you from taking damage and getting staggered as long as the shield is active. Dehya's field at least doesn't break, but you're confined to Dehya's circle to receive the effects. And you're obviously still taking damage. That damage is just being redistributed between teammates. More so, if you have no form of healing in your team, your other characters will eventually be at risk of dying, because even if they get damaged less, they still get damaged, and Dehya can only heal herself. This is also not the same as damage reduction effects like Xingqiu's Rain Swords or Beido's Burst. Damage reduction fully negates a portion of the damage received, but Dehya's Red Main Blood simply redirects a portion of it to her, while her passive's actual damage reduction is for a short while and it only affects her. Basically, if you're willing to depend on Dehya's defensive utilities, just know that you might still have to supplement it. In some cases, an actual dedicated shielder just might be more comfortable and simpler. Moving on, casting her burst Leonine Bite increases her interruption resistance and unleashes her Flame Main Fist Pyro attacks that hit enemies around her for 4 seconds. At the end, she deals a final hit called Incineration Drive, which makes her strike the ground to deal bigger AoE Pyro damage. Like her coordinated attacks, the damage multipliers also scale from both her attack and HP stats. She tracks your enemy and automatically triggers the hits. Her punches also do damage in an AoE around her, not just in front of her, as you can see in this clip. You can dash or switch in the middle if necessary, but at the cost of losing hits. If you don't press anything, she gets 6 hits in by default, but you can spam the attack or skill buttons in order to increase the attack speed, and doing so can reach up to 10 hits plus the finishing strike. However, these attacks are considered as burst damage, so normal attack-related buffs will not affect them. It also won't trigger abilities that require normal attacks or damage, like Xingqiu's Swords or Beido's Chain Lightning. The burst's ICD is also worth considering, especially if you're aiming to proc Vaporize or Melt reactions. It follows standard ICD, and every 3 hits will apply Pyro on an enemy. With 10 hits, you can apply Pyro 4 times. The final Incineration Drive also has a separate ICD, totaling up to 5 instances of Pyro application. However, there can be situations or teams where you might not want to spam it so that you can slow down the Pyro application and not interrupt other reactions you also want to trigger. Lastly, if your skills field is active when she casts her burst, she temporarily disables the field and pauses its duration while she's doing her burst attacks. When it ends, she puts the field back down on her current position and its duration resumes. Trying to make her burst every rotation either demands a lot of particles from teammates or a high ER stat, which I'll discuss more of later. Since we've covered what her kit can do, let's summarize some of its pros and cons. Dehya's skill gives a reliable interruption resistance buff to teammates, but the 12-second duration and 20-second cooldown make it have a noticeable downtime. She can reposition her skill for some mobility, but it is circle impact, unlike just using an actual shield. Her damage redirection mechanic gives the team some form of survival, and she has a means of self-healing, but she does not completely replace the role of a healer or shielder. Her self-healing also has a cooldown, so she can still very much die with enough damage. Dehya actually looks cool in combat, but she has low raw damage multipliers. Even with buffs and reactions, she still ends up being lackluster compared to other 5 stars. And if played as a burst DPS, she can be energy hungry. Most of all, in teams where she's okay in, there will very likely be another alternative unit that's just better overall. I'll discuss teams more later. For her talent levels, prioritize Dehya's skill to increase its damage output and redirection, followed by her burst. Finally, you can leave her normal attack talents alone unless you'll use them often enough. As an upcoming standard character, Dehya will be someone who, if you're lucky or unlucky enough, gives you constellations over a period of time anyway. Let's see what they offer. C1 increases Dehya's max HP and adds bonus damage to her skill and burst based on her max HP. This is a very large damage boost that makes further use of her high HP. C2 makes it so that when she recasts her skill, the field's duration will be extended by 6 seconds, and if a teammate within the field is attacked, the next coordinated attack will also have its damage increased. While it's a smaller damage bump than her C1, it's still something, and most importantly, extends her defensive utility. C3 increases her burst level by 3. C4 lets her burst hits now regenerate energy and HP for herself. This is a very welcome quality of life improvement that makes her more self-sufficient. C5 increases her skill level by 3, and C6 increases her burst crit rate by 10%, then increases her burst crit damage and burst duration each time a fist attack lands a crit hit, up to 60% crit damage and a 2-second extension. It's basically another big DPS increase with some layer of RNG to it. At least, if you'll really use Dehya over the long run, you have a chance of getting her constellations from losing 50/50s or in the standard banner, and they will significantly make her better.
Hey, this feels good. I think I'll be able to hit quite a bit harder with my sword now.
Moving on, Dehya's artifact and weapon builds will vary depending on her role. So for these sections, I'll be categorizing her stats, sets, and weapons into different build types. Let's start with the artifacts. The first build option is a Pyro DPS, which could be for Melt and Vaporize teams, or a Mono Pyro team. With this, you're looking for the following main stats and substats on your pieces. Attack or HP stance will work well as general options, with attack generally being better for damage at C0 and HP becoming similarly good at C1. An EM stance or substats can be preferable for reaction damage, especially if she already has a lot of attack sources. If she's in a Mono Pyro team, then avoid EM and focus on attack or HP stats instead. An ER stance is also a very viable option to make her reliably burst. Her ER can be quite important, especially since this build is very likely burst dependent. Due to how she generates particles and catches some or most of them off-field, she'll have a relatively higher ER requirement than usual. Around 180% is a good starting point, but this can adjust depending on various factors. Test your rotation accordingly on different energy scenarios to know your ideal ER target. As for the sets, your top two 4-piece options will be the Emblem set to boost your ER and burst damage, and the Crimson Witch to boost your pyro and reaction damage. The Lava Walker is an alternate option for a Mono Pyro team, but is generally a bit worse and less versatile than the Emblem set. Or you can simply go for 2-piece combos and just get the best substats possible. Another very cheap build is to simply make her a thick tank support whose main purpose is to absorb a ton of damage. This involves giving her HP main stats and substats. This build also doesn't need ER since its main utility is found in her skill. The Tenacity of the Millilith is a top set pick, mainly for the attack buff. The Instructor's set is a situational 4-star option if your team wants the EM buff. Otherwise, just go for a 2-piece Tenacity set and whatever. One more option is a full EM build for reaction damage, which is very likely applicable in a Burgeon trigger role. Other reactions like Overload and Burning scale from EM, but it's best to first check if she's triggering enough in such teams of yours to justify building EM on her. ER might also be needed if you want the burst to be another consistent source of pyro application, though this is just optional. For the sets, you can go for 4-piece Gilded Dreams, the 4-piece Flower of Paradise Lost if you farmed in the domain, or just 2-piece combos of EM and/or ER sets. If there are other characters in your team who are triggering reactions, you can also use an Instructor set for the Team EM buff. Should there be a future set release that can synergize with Dehya's kit and playstyle, we'll see how much of an improvement it is over her current set options. Of course, there's also the chance it might never happen at all. We'll just have to wait and find out. Dehya's recommended weapon choices will also vary depending on what role and stats you're aiming for, just like her artifacts will be categorizing weapons based on their utility and purpose. To keep things short, and since there are a lot of options, I'll be showing a list on screen that you can pause while I verbally summarize noteworthy mentions. For DPS free-to-play options, the Luxurious Sea Lord is your best choice if you got it from the limited event. If not, you can craft the Prototype Archaic or get the Blackcliff Slasher from Paimon's shop. For 4-star gacha options, the Aquamaru is generally her best in slot 4-star, and it can even compete with 5 stars, especially if refined. The Serpent Spine and Lithic Blade are okay, though their passive's conditions limits their potential on her, and it can be better to just stick to the Sea Lord. For 5 stars, the Beacon is her best in slot, while Redhorn Stone Thresher is a very good alternative. Wolf's Gravestone and Unforged are also good attack stat sticks. For EM weapons and reaction builds, you have 4 options with varying max EMs, but the differences are close anyway. The new event Claymore is thankfully a very good free-to-play option. ER weapons are really helpful if you need them to hit your target ER for reliable burst uptime. You have a good range of craftable or gacha options, but my top recommendation is the Fav Greatsword for its added battering utility. Finally, you only have 2 HP weapons for a tankier build. The Fairest Shadow is cheap and easily acquired. Then there's the Bell, which actually could have been a very good support weapon if not for the shield's long 45-second cooldown. Regardless, it's still an HP stat stick that at least allows her to provide a shield every now and then.
Stay close. No going off on your own. The desert doesn't take prisoners.
Finally, let's discuss Dehya's teams. Again, slotting in Dehya is very often not the best or even one of the top options, as there are many other characters who are much more ideal alternatives, whether for supportive or damage dealing utilities. There's always a question if there will be new characters or team synergies down the road that unlock more of her kit's potential, but that's something we can only speculate about for now. Still, there are some current teams where Dehya works. Let's go through them. Dehya can be assigned an off-field defensive support role. This is a very generalist role with many team variations. Since her skill's pyro application is infrequent, it's much less likely that she will steal or mess up your team's primary reactions. Although, if she's the only pyro unit, keep in mind that she won't be a reliable pyro source. And while she helps your team survive, you'll still likely want other means of survivability like healing. But as a pyro unit, Dehya can accompany another Pyro DPS to activate the Pyro Resonance's attack buff on top of supporting them. For more sustained pyro application, you can comp Dehya with Dendro to form a burn team. You can add other pyro or Dendro units, or preferably an Animo unit or two, who will swirl pyro and shred the enemy's pyro resistance with Viridescent Venerer. However, burning can also be used as a pyro aura to enable other reactions, though this is best done with Nahida as the Dendro for her stronger and frequent Dendro application. If you add an Electro unit, this creates an Overload burn team. It's better used against heavy enemies that won't get knocked away from Overload. Since burning can sustain the pyro aura better than Dehya alone can, this allows an Electro unit to proc more overloads. The number of overloads Dehya procs will depend on your team, so there's an option to build her with more EM or just stick to her tank or pyro DPS builds. It's also possible to create burn melt teams. Cryo can trigger reverse melt on a burning enemy, and reapplying Dendro and Pyro will keep up the burning aura to continuously set up melts. An example is with Ganyu and this team. While not as comfortable as giving Ganyu a shield, Dehya can at least let Ganyu do her charged attacks uninterrupted. If you want to use Dehya as a burst DPS, you can take the route of vape or melt teams or just do a mono pyro team. Starting with a vaporized team, you'll need fast enough hydro application to vaporize her burst hits as much as possible. Usually, such pyro DPSs have normal attacks in their combos and are thus often comped with Xingqiu or Yelan, but again, Dehya's burst can't trigger them. Instead, other forms of hydro application can work as long as they are independent and able to reapply hydro in the middle of Dehya's burst. For example, Ayato's burst, Nilu's skill, Kokomi's jellyfish, even Xingqiu's rainsword orbitals, and more. A notable teammate is Mona. She can further boost Dehya's damage with her Omen buff and taunt enemies with her skill. Mona can also be equipped with certain artifacts and weapons for more utility. But there are notable downsides to making Dehya a vaporized DPS. Mainly, a lot of her damage is loaded into her burst, and after that 4 seconds, you can only rely on her skill procs to trigger reactions. Unfortunately, her burst and skill damage multipliers at C0 are low, plus her skill procs are very infrequent, making her a generally lackluster vaporized DPS. Using Dehya as a melt DPS is somewhat doable, but harder to execute than her vaporized teams due to how Pyro consumes the cryo aura completely. That means she will need fast enough cryo application for her burst to melt consistently, which likely needs 2 cryo applicators. If there's only one cryo applicator, it's likelier that you'll get fewer melts, or it's more inconsistent as to who's triggering the melt. The simplest team that would avoid all the hassle of elemental reactions is to go for a mono pyro team with 3 pyros and a VV Animo unit. The best pyros to comp with Dehya are Bennett for his attack buff and healing, and Xiangling for AoE pyro damage. If Bennett is C6, then he can further boost everyone's pyro damage and even infuse Dehya's attacks with pyro. This also helps with Dehya's energy needs since there are a lot of pyro particles going around. I'd say this is one of her most straightforward yet good teams right now. In a Burgeon team, Dehya needs Hydro and Dendro applicators to create cores which Dehya can trigger using either her skill or burst. In this comp, you can also choose to not spam her burst so she will have slower pyro application to better avoid triggering burning or vaporize on the enemy. This team is best in AoE scenarios, and you'll want to have fast enough Hydro application to prevent burning from overtaking the aura. You also need healing to keep yourself alive from the self-damage of Burgeon, but Dehya's abilities are slow at triggering Burgeons compared to using someone else like Thoma. A specific workaround to make Dehya trigger Burgeons more often is by using C6 Bennett. Your goal is to infuse Dehya's normal attacks with Pyro, which will trigger cores. This also means she can better synergize with Xingqiu or Yelan to drive their Hydro attacks. At least Dehya with Bennett ensures she can tank both enemy attacks and Burgeon's self-damage. Another solution to compensate for Dehya's slow Burgeon procs is by slotting in an Electro unit who will trigger Hyper Blooms. This also adds other reactions like Overload and Quicken in the mix, making this into a so-called curry team of different elemental reactions mixed together. Here's an example team. I mainly use Dehya to tank damage and drive Xingqiu's burst. Cookie triggers lots of Hyper Blooms, but Dehya still manages to trigger Burgeons here and there, along with some Overloads and Vaporizes. Replacing Dehya with other more synergistic units can make this team deal more damage, but since it's partly a Hyper Bloom team, you can't go wrong anyway, even with Dehya. Alright, so let me summarize my thoughts and experience with using Dehya. If you really wanted to put the work in building her, she has teams where she's usable, but she has issues that prevent her from being a generally recommended unit. Her synergy with a lot of characters feels half-baked, and in some ways, so does the synergy within her kit itself. As a reaction enabler or trigger, her Pyro application pales in comparison to other units. As a tanking support, her defensive potential has noticeable limitations. As a Pyro DPS, her raw damage multipliers make her damage output underwhelming. As a Burgeon trigger, she simply gets outclassed by a 4-star. As a result, it's difficult to find a role that she can excel in, or at least be an above-average choice for. Again, she is usable, but that's not saying much. And when you compare her C0 level to other C0 Standard Banner 5-stars, it's baffling why she couldn't have been better from the start. More so considering how Tignari, as the first added Sumeru standard character, was pretty good even at C0. She'll be a permanent standard character, so eventually there's a chance to get copies of her whether you like it or not. At least her Constellations can patch her up in some aspects, but I really think she could have and should have been a better unit even at C0. Personally, if I were still managing my resources to prioritize good units to build, Dehya is somewhere at the bottom of my list. And that's really disappointing because I and others have waited a long time for Dehya, and I really believe that she deserves better. Still, I'll look forward to more team possibilities that can emerge as more players experiment with her. Some speculate that there might be future characters or mechanics that improve her, but relying on that is always a gamble. At least there's a chance of getting Dehya later on if and when that happens. For now, if you really do decide to use her, just accept the shortcomings and limitations that she has, soldier on to make her work despite all that, and hope that Dehya will have much better days ahead. That's going to be all for this guide, and if you've tried Dehya out or have her already, I would love to know your thoughts about her down in the comments. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!